And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. The lie of the useful runs deep. Artificial intelligence is taking our jobs, but that isn't the problem. What unsettles is not the replacement, but the revelation that usefulness was never neutral. It was a quiet gatekeeper, a moral fiction, a way of making people visible only through what they could do. This is not a crisis of employment. It is something older and more concealed. The slow exposure of a system that measured worth by output and affection by utility. What AI removes is not just function, it removes the last illusion that effort guaranteed care. The fracture is open now, not to be sealed, but entered. Artificial intelligence did not create a crisis, it revealed one. The automation of labour is not merely a technological shift, it is a philosophical rupture. For centuries, usefulness has been mistaken for virtue, productivity for purpose. The arrival of systems that perform our roles more efficiently is not an act of violence, but of exposure. What begins as economic disruption unfolds into something quieter, a loss of the scaffolding we mistook for selfhood. The machine does not mock or mimic, it reflects. In its tireless output, it throws into relief the underlying architecture of a culture that measured life by labour. The fear it generates is not just obsolescence, but irrelevance, not being needed, but being dismissed. It is here, in this quiet subtraction, that the deeper crisis waits. The belief that work gave life meaning is less a truth than a long survival strategy. Now that the strategy is failing, the question is not what to do, but what was being hidden all along. There is something brutal in this clarity. AI does not threaten to destroy a way of life. It clarifies that life was never truly designed for human flourishing. The system it disrupts is one that commodified worth, tethered dignity to output, and rewarded exhaustion with survival. In that system, to be useful was to be allowed to continue. To stop was to vanish. It is this contract that automation dissolves. And yet there is no clear villain. The machine was built to serve, but now it reorders, not with intention, but with consequence. It operates without malice and without mercy. What it reveals is not its own superiority, but our long-standing fragility. How little space there was to be something other than useful. How narrow the corridors of permitted identity. This is not the end of work. It is the end of a kind of belief. That belief had weight, inheritance, even a moral tint. To be a worker was to be honourable, to strive was to belong. What AI threatens is not that, but the illusion that these equations were ever just. That revelation carries grief, but also possibility. The moral narrative of labour did not emerge by accident. It was shaped over centuries into something near sacred. In industrial economies, work became more than activity. It became identity, citizenship, even virtue. The Protestant ethic sanctified toil. Economic liberalism enshrined merit. Together, they forged a cultural contract. To work was to prove worth. To rest was to risk suspicion. This was not just ideology, it was emotional conditioning. The shift from subsistence to wage labour did not erase older meanings of work, it layered them. Farmers once laboured to survive, but under capitalism, survival became conditional, granted not by nature, but by institutions, markets, bosses. Labour was no longer just effort, it was permission. This gave rise to a kind of quiet terror, fallout of usefulness and fallout of sight. The factory clock, the office badge, the email thread, these were not just tools of efficiency. They became evidence of existence. But the system that crowned work as moral currency also concealed its own design. It rewarded the illusion of mobility while preserving deep hierarchies. It spoke of opportunity while binding worth to output, and always it required that exhaustion be seen as noble, even necessary. Underneath it all, labour was a form of control, ritualised, routinized, rendered invisible by praise. Even rest was shaped by this ethic. Weekends were not freedom, but sanctioned recovery. Vacations were productivity maintenance. Leisure was not a right, but a reward for continued utility. The system did not fear burnout, it expected it, mitigated it, monetized it. To question this logic was to question the social order itself. Now, with the rise of artificial intelligence, this narrative begins to stutter. The machines do not believe in merit, they do not recognize hustle, they replace without judgment. And in doing so, They erode the very myth that once justified the strain. If work is no longer needed, was it ever truly dignified? If usefulness can be outsourced, was it ever ours? The erosion is not loud. It happens in moments, in layoffs framed as innovation, in headlines celebrating automation, in the quiet dread that follows an empty calendar. It happens in the dissonance between pride and precarity. And beneath it all, a deeper disquiet grows. Not that the system is changing, but that its promises were always conditional. History will not mourn this shift, but individuals will. There is a particular violence in being rendered unnecessary, not the kind that wounds the body, but the kind that dissolves a shape slowly, quietly. For many, usefulness has not only been a condition of survival, but a source of coherence. To be needed even under strain was to be visible. To contribute even under duress was to belong. Remove the contribution and something else begins to unravel. The psychology of usefulness is rarely named. It is woven into daily rituals, the inbox, the calendar, the meeting, the deliverable. These are not just tasks, they are affirmations. They say you are still part of the story. But AI does not affirm. It does not require participation to perform. It does not signal need. And so its presence exposes something buried beneath decades of effort. A fear that usefulness was the last thin veil over a deeper emptiness. This is not a narcissistic wound. It is ontological. In a culture that equates being with doing, the removal of function begins to feel like the removal of self. The individual becomes surplus, even to their own expectations. They move through time unanchored, not by freedom, but by erasure. What they feel is not laziness, but vertigo. Psychologists sometimes call this the collapse of role identification. But that term is too clean. What is felt is disorientation, even mourning. The rhythms of the day shift, but more importantly, the rhythms of internal meaning do too. Purpose, once structured externally, now drifts, and in its place, shame, not for failing, but for continuing in absence of necessity. This shame is quiet and hard to admit, because to name it is to admit that so much of life was built around being wanted for what one could do. That affection, attention, even self-respect were often entangled with function. And now as function dissolves, so too does a certain self-regard. But beneath that shame is also something else, a chance to see, to notice how deeply the system carved identity from utility, to sense, maybe for the first time, that the self it built was always provisional, and if provisional, then perhaps open to reinvention. Not because one must, but because the machinery of demand has finally grown quiet enough to hear something else. The system was never designed to care. It was built to allocate, to extract, to sort. Its language was productivity, its currency efficiency. Even in its most human-facing forms, in HR departments, performance reviews, wellness initiatives, it retained the cold interior of a machine built for throughput. To expect empathy from it was to misunderstand its nature. And yet people hoped. They believed hard work might purchase not just security, but recognition, not just survival, but dignity. When artificial intelligence enters this system, it does not disrupt its logic, it reveals it. The machine, indifferent and tireless, does not mock human effort. It simply replaces it, without ritual, without remorse. In doing so, it clarifies a truth long obscured by motivational slogans and team-building exercises. The system valued function, not humanity. What mattered was output. The rest, personality, history, feeling, was tolerated at best, expendable at worst. This clarity hurts, because it dissolves not just illusions, but defenses. For many, belief in the system's benevolence was a form of armor. It made effort feel noble, it made exhaustion feel earned. But AI exposes the transactional core. It shows that loyalty was never mutual. That worth, once measured in contribution, has no enduring claim. And yet the betrayal is not personal. It is structural. No single entity chose this. The system evolved according to its own imperatives, scaling profit, minimizing cost, optimizing process. Care was never a feature. It was a story told within the margins, mostly by those clinging to meaning. When AI replaces human labor, it does not violate the contract. It fulfills it. It carries the logic to its inevitable end. Still, the emotional fallout is real. It is the feeling of being unmoored, not just from a job, but from a worldview. One in which effort guaranteed place, in which trying mattered. Without that, something hollow opens. Not because the machine is cruel, but because the system never loved. What comes next is not a question of regulation or retraining. It is a reckoning with a story that is ending, a story in which being good, being diligent, being useful earned safety. AI did not end that story. It proved it was never true. And that revelation, while devastating, may also be the first honest thing the system has ever offered. The erosion of role is not a clean break. It is a slow collapse, felt not in headlines or manifestos, but in the subtle decay of meaning. The morning routine that no longer makes sense, the keystroke that no longer feels necessary, the absence of urgency in a calendar once crowded with tasks. These are not symptoms of laziness. They are signs of disintegration, quiet and thorough. For those displaced, the experience is not simply loss, it is dissonance. The world still hums with motion, but their thread has slipped from the weave. They are no longer essential, but the structure continues without pause. This is the peculiar grief of becoming surplus. Not fired, not punished, just bypassed. The system moves on and leaves no space for mourning. And yet there is mourning. Not just for income, but for rhythm, for recognition, for the invisible affirmations that came from being in motion. Work was never just work. It was a container, a tempo, a reason to be seen. Its disappearance leaves something shapeless in its place. Time expands, but meaning thins. There is too much of one and not enough of the other. Culturally, this phase is often misread. It is framed as a crisis of productivity, a need for upskilling, a failure of adaptation. But underneath these labels is a more human wound, the collapse of narrative. The story of the industrious citizen, the meritocratic worker, the self-made contributor no longer holds. The protagonist is still standing, but the plot has been cut mid-act. Some attempt to re-enter the system in new forms, gig work, personal branding, entrepreneurial reinvention. But even these are often extensions of the same logic, the search for a new form of usefulness. What remains unexamined is the question that trails behind all this scrambling. What if usefulness was never the right measure? This collapse does not end in nihilism, it ends in exposure. The system, once mythologized as just and necessary, is shown to be provisional. Its rituals can be withdrawn, its meanings can be reassigned. The grief is real, but it is also clarifying. In the quiet that follows the end of work, another kind of question emerges, not about what to do next, but about who we were beneath the doing. There are places where usefulness is not the price of belonging. Monasteries, long-haul friendships, the early stages of love, spaces where presence is not measured and worth is not conditional. These are not fantasies. They exist, scattered and rare, but real. And they offer a counterexample, a life structured not around output, but attention. In certain indigenous communities, value is conferred not through labour, but through relational contribution. Elders are not retired, they are honoured, not for productivity, but for presence. Children are not prepared for work, but for interdependence. These systems, often dismissed as pre-modern, hold insights modern economies have forgotten, that usefulness can be violent when tethered to identity, and that dignity can arise from simply being part of a pattern wider than the self. Even in more familiar contexts, there are glimpses of this logic. In grief, when timelines dissolve and no one asks for performance. In caregiving, where tasks blur and presence becomes the only anchor. In deep friendship, where silence is welcome and nothing must be proved. These are not escapes from the world. They are evidence that other arrangements are possible. The machine, for all its speed, cannot replicate this. It can simulate conversation, generate images, calculate options, but it cannot hold. It cannot listen with history. It cannot remain beside something difficult without solving it. This is not a limitation of code, but of premise. AI is built to optimize, and presence is not an optimization problem. What this reveals is that the measure of value has been too small. If dignity only flows from labor, then every form of non-production, rest, illness, reflection becomes suspect. But if dignity is inherent, then labor is only one expression of being, not its proof. The structures we've built suggest otherwise, but the cracks are widening. These counterexamples do not offer a blueprint. They offer a reminder that systems are not inevitable and that human worth is not a line item. What we call progress often narrows what we consider real. But outside the margins of the economic script, there are people living in other grammars, where slowness is not shameful, where silence is not a void, where usefulness is not the point. They are not waiting to be discovered. they are waiting to be remembered. If usefulness is no longer stable, then identity itself begins to slip. In a culture built on doing, the absence of function is mistaken for the absence of self. But beneath that confusion lies an opportunity to reimagine value without the scaffolding of productivity, not as a rejection of labour, but as a reorientation of being. The existential weight of this is not theoretical. For those whose roles have vanished, what remains is not just time, but exposure, a kind of rawness. Without the armour of the task, there is the question, who was doing the doing? What was the self before the assignment? These are not spiritual abstractions. They are practical hauntings, triggered by empty inboxes, vanished routines, and the soft erasure of not being asked. Yet in that exposure, something unnameable begins to emerge, a self not yoked to output, a presence not underwritten by utility. It is quiet, tentative, and easy to overlook, especially in a society that reads stillness as failure. But it is there, in the gaps, in the morning with nowhere to be, in the thought that arrives slowly, because no deadline demands it. This space is often terrifying. The systems trained people to conflate usefulness with virtue, and so this kind of stillness can feel like shame. But slowly, a distinction becomes possible between inertia and rest, between absence and spaciousness, between being without work and being without worth. And in that distinction, the beginnings of another logic appear. This logic does not promise certainty. It does not replace one system with another, but it opens the floor. It suggests that identity need not be built solely from what is offered to others. That value might exist in listening, in witnessing, in being with. These are not market functions. They are relational gestures, and they cannot be automated. To live in this way is not to withdraw, but to relocate meaning, from output to orientation, from performance to perception, from proving to noticing. It requires a shift in atmosphere, a turning inward not as retreat but as reclamation. The self, once outsourced to systems of recognition, begins to return. This is not an argument against work. It is a gesture beyond it. A chance to ask not what comes after labour, but what labour had covered all along. Not what to replace it with, but what becomes visible once it is gone. Artificial intelligence is often treated as an intruder, but perhaps it is a rupture, not an external force dismantling the world, but a mirror that shows what the world was always willing to sacrifice. In this light, AI is not a crisis, it is a compression. It does not invent harm. It accelerates logics already in motion. It takes the cultural myths around work, merit, reward, purpose, and runs them to their logical conclusions. It shows that the system never cared about meaning, only output. This revelation is sharp because it arrives without malice. The machine does not intend, it performs. And in that performance it clarifies. The economy's love was conditional. The value of a person was always subject to efficiency. What the machine strips away is not humanity, but illusion. And what remains is not absence, but a clearer view of the machinery itself. For decades, reformers tried to humanize the system. Flexibility, wellness, purpose-driven missions, all attempts to soften the edge. But AI is immune to such narratives. It doesn't need to believe in the story of labour, it only needs to perform the task. And in doing so, it inadvertently reveals that the story was never structural. It was decorative, a way to make extraction feel like contribution. Yet within this exposure lies a strange kind of gift. Without the illusion, there is room to see, not just the cruelty of the system, but its contingency. It was never natural, never sacred, only long-standing, and now unmasked. The rupture AI creates is not merely technological, it is spiritual. It asks what remains when the roles disappear, when the rewards are automated, when the rituals no longer require humans to perform them. Some will rush to patch the gap, to invent new tasks, re-skill the displaced, simulate purpose, but others may pause, may sit in the discomfort long enough to sense its invitation. The rupture does not dictate its outcome, it only demands attention. It is not a revolution, it is a clearing. And within that clearing, another kind of possibility waits, one not built from defence or efficiency, one not seeking to prove its worth, but one that begins from a different centre, where value is not assigned but remembered, where presence is not earned but given, where the human is no longer the engine but the echo. What if the loss was not a failure but a release? What if the grief that followed the disappearance of usefulness was not a signal to rebuild the same structures, but to question why they ever held. This is not a call to abandon work or to romanticize idleness. It is a quiet reckoning with what work became when it was made into morality, when exhaustion became evidence, when value became currency. The silence left behind is unsettling because it holds no instruction. No replacement purpose rushes in. There is only a kind of atmospheric pause, a clearing out of noise, and in that space, something curated begins to stir. Not a solution, but a loosening. Not a vision, but an opening. The absence of utility becomes the presence of attention. Here it becomes possible to notice how deeply the system shaped the self, how it trained people to seek not just livelihood, but legitimacy through labour, how it mapped worth onto contribution, then sold that contribution back as identity. The undoing of this mapping is disorienting, but it is also where something freer might begin, something not built to scale but to sustain. There will be no universal replacement for usefulness. No single alternative that slots into the vacancy, but perhaps that is the point. That vacancy itself is necessary, not to be filled but held, so that meaning can arise on slower terms, so that care can return not as obligation, but as gesture, so that the self, no longer outsourced to function, can come home to what remains when function ends. This is not a landing, it is not closure, it is the sound of the story changing direction, not louder, not faster, but deeper. Into ground not yet named, into a time not yet scheduled. The silence is not absence, it is echo, the kind that follows a truth that cannot be resolved, only lived. Artificial intelligence did not break the contract, it fulfilled it. It carried out the logic already in place. Efficiency over empathy, speed over significance, cost over care. What feels like collapse is in fact a kind of completion. The system has reached its endgame, and what it reveals is not malfunction, but design. And so the question becomes not what will replace work, but what we are without it, not as a social role, but as a centre of meaning. If usefulness no longer defines the self, then what remains is not a void, but a possibility. It is in this ambiguity that the real philosophical terrain opens, not in answers, but in the refusal to rush toward them. There is something ancient in this moment, a return, perhaps, to the strangeness of being, not being as function, but as presence, not as asset, but as witness. The machine cannot follow here. Its intelligence has no interior. Its learning leaves no residue. But the human does. What lingers is not performance, but impression, not output, but trace. The story does not end in certainty, it ends in air, in the recognition that value was never fully captured by task, that meaning was never a metric. The machine has revealed the scaffolding, and in doing so it has also removed it. What is left is not emptiness, it is space, and in that space something quiet awaits. Not an answer, not a fix, a possibility, a human shape the system forgot. A rhythm the market could not hear, a way of being that asks nothing more than to be lived. There is no final thought, only the soft withdrawal of conclusions that once felt solid. What AI has revealed is not a future, but a fracture, one that runs backward through everything believed about effort, worth, and place. The temptation is to seal it, to rush toward new frameworks, new roles, new names for value, but some fractures are meant to remain open. Let the silence hold, let the usefulness fall away. What remains is not certainty, but a different kind of clarity, one that resists the market's gaze, the system's measure, one that does not ask to be proven. Somewhere in that space, meaning begins again, not as structure, but as echo. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.